How's your
Super.
shoulder doing?
Shoulder is good. Yeah. So I think I separated my AC joint now like 5 weeks ago.
Hmm.
Bike accident. Um, and I've just been using it and training that joint for the last 4 or 5 weeks now. But it's almost 100%. I mean, because I completely tore all the ligaments in, as part of that AC joint structure and the
Yeah.
connective tissue and such. It'll take some time, but
Mhm.
it also needs tissue and joint specific work. So thankfully, I've just been using the system that I teach and use with clients and myself every day. And it's, yeah, I mean, I've been sparring and trying to go with the right people, but I mean, I basically, I don't really have any issues with it outside of jiu-jitsu specific positions. Um,
Mhm.
but it's coming along. Yeah, it could have been way worse. And it's actually quite a frequent injury. Cycling and also in jiu-jitsu, you see people with that little deformity. That's a AC joint separation, depending on the grade and such. But yeah, it's a lot better. But like, it's interesting going through because I did want to get an X-ray and I did want to make sure that nothing was broken and needed surgery. But it's interesting going through the sort of standard approach. Outside of the surgical advice, like when you ask them what kinds of things you should and shouldn't do, it's really, it kind of blows my mind how general the recommendations are. Like, cast your arm, you know, don't move your arm, don't do push-ups,
Mhm.
and then you should be good to go in like 4 to 6 weeks, which is really probably what gets said to most people. But like, that's not really very specific guidance. You would agree?
I mean, we're here asking you what the specific guidance is. So,
Yeah,
did you
well,
have
I
to have
mean,
surgery for it?
no, yeah, I didn't have to have surgery. From what I understand about surgeries, they'll go and they'll put a plate and they'll hook it under the acromion to basically minimize or anchor down where that clavicle has separated from,
Mhm.
and that can cause some issues over time, just depending on like the person, and obviously there's lots of connective tissue structures and such in that area. So really the biggest thing is you're kind of left with this deformity, which is really not a big deal. Once
Mm.
tissue scars over, then it's just about training that tissue so that you are, you effectively help it remodel to make it more robust and durable. Um, but yeah, the general advice is really, telling somebody to just cast their arm up or not to do push-ups. Um, like that's really simplifying the problem. Like it's not, it can't be that simple to just cast your arm up, don't do push-ups, and your AC joint will be fine. And it kind of is holding on to this idea that's a little bit incomplete, which is basically, when you have an injury, don't obviously uh, insult or make the injury worse, which I certainly agree with. But there's a whole potential to start to address that injured tissue effectively from the moment you get injured and help it start to remodel a little bit more specifically, because the body does not heal perfectly. That's what scar tissue is. Scar tissue is connective tissue that's haphazardly laid down. It's got some structural stability, but there's no integrity to that tissue, meaning it's not good quality tissue. It's just something that your body does a great job of, as it effectively, tries to create through wound healing mechanisms, tries to do something about the fact that my AC joint ligaments are torn.
Like a
But
band-aid, pretty much.
yeah, and that's, I mean, again, it's amazing that the body heals as well as it does, but it
Hmm.
doesn't heal perfectly. And I think that's something that's known, but I think what's not understood well is that you have a huge potential to actually remodel the quality of that tissue as it heals over time so that you can have better quality tissue than you had pre-injury. If you think about an injury like kind of simply, and we can get into, I know you had some questions about like ACL stuff. We also don't have to jump into this right away, but like think about an ACL tear. So if somebody tears their ACL, it's kind of, however the mechanism, in a lot of ways, there is an indication to some degree that the training was not sufficient to help effectively try to mitigate that ACL tear, right? Like if you get an injury somewhere in your body, let's just use the ACL as an example. Well, clearly the knee specific training that you're doing is not maybe up to snuff with ensuring that you have good quality, let's say, connective tissue and load bearing capacity in that connective tissue, such that you can mitigate the risk of ACL tears. If you look at a lot of ACL people that have torn their ACLs, it's not uncommon that they've torn that same ACL not only twice, but sometimes up to 3 times. Obviously, that's not always the case, but that's good information that not only was their knee not in the best state from a tissue-specific capacity standpoint prior to the first ACL tear, but the fact that their rehabilitation did not give them enough of a tissue-specific buffer in and around that knee that they tore their ACL on that same knee again, if that makes sense. So it's like we're just not doing enough joint and connective tissue specific training in general, and that's why joint connective tissue dysfunction is effectively everywhere in every sport. So with respect to like, tying it back to the AC joint and healing and stuff like that, that's really the, I think, gem to digest, is that there is a lot more that you can do when you have an injury. Resting has its place 100%, but if that's all you do, there's no reason to expect that area to be not only healed, but in a robust state to then go take the insults that you're going to throw at it with your sport or with your lifting. There's literally no reason to think that that area is going to be in good shape because you haven't done anything specifically to ensure that, if that makes sense, other than rest and heal.
So is that what you're trying to do with your social media posts, is lead by example and show people, hey, you don't have to take a break from a major injury like the one you experienced?
Yeah, 100%. I think that, it's hard because a lot of people obviously deal with injuries, but I think how those injuries are managed, unfortunately, there's just a lot of passive modalities and like you said, band-aids. And that's not gonna, for example, if you injure your knee and you put a knee brace on, well, you didn't do anything to specifically address the tissue in that knee, like where you have a weak point. You just put a brace on it.
I hate wearing knee braces. Anytime I've had knee pain, people are like, "Oh, wear a knee brace, and I hate doing it. I might tape it if I really feel like I need to, or I'll just rest. I don't really know what to do about it right now.
Yeah, and again, it's like, it's not to say that taping doesn't have its place, not to say that wearing a knee brace doesn't have its place. You could extend this to icing and heating and using whatever, again, passive inputs you want to use, but that's not doing anything to specifically address the weak point or the tissue quality problem in the knee. And I think that what we often forget, and again, it's really the fault of our industry at large. Like, it's not really the athlete or the client's fault because they're coming to us. But one of the big problems, or one of many, is that there's no consistent language in the industry. You can go see 10 different people and get 10 different problems. Your left leg is too long, your right ear is small, your big toe, like people just walk away confused with like, well, what's my actual problem? And I think that's something that I think we do a really good job, functional range systems, of trying to unify a language, because anatomy and physiology is a science. And there's no reason that in a science we can't have a common language and a framework to talk about soft tissue injuries, dysfunction, athletic performance. And I think that's a major reason why Dr. Andrea Spina, created this 20 years ago and has been teaching and leading these continuing education courses for that long.
I know you and I've talked a lot about FRC, and I'm going to take your seminar at the end of September. But for the listeners out there, what is FRC? How can you explain it in layman's terms for people to understand?
Yeah, that's a great question. So functional range conditioning is really the entry-level course to functional range systems. So functional range systems is a continuing education company that teaches everything from soft tissue palpation, assessment, training, treatment, to joint specific problems that somebody's having, to joint and connective tissue and muscle based training. So because it's a system and not a method, I think that here we go, we're pulling this up. So obviously functional anatomy seminars, you can find out more about the courses. Dr. Andrea Spina also has a podcast, Control Yourself, which is also available for free. There's lots of YouTube snippets of lectures and such, but functional range conditioning is the entry-level course, going over a lot of the background science as to why we do what we do and why joint-specific prerequisites are necessary if you're interested in developing optimally as an athlete, or whether you need to manage injuries. And that's really probably the best way that I can summarize it. There's a lot of background science and lecture that you get access to that I think what's funny about, questions around the courses is the science has been out there for a long time. And it's not that we're, changing what the science says. We're just following what studies in mechanobiology or understanding what a joint is made up of from a tissue specific standpoint, and using that as basically evidence, so evidence-based medicine, for the arguments that we make and why we should train these structures the way that we train them. Mm-hmm. So not only do you get a lot of background science, but you also then obviously get all the practical, in terms of what kinds of inputs we use, why we use those inputs, when you would use those inputs, and really gives you a framework to problem solve your injuries and limitations and such, which is really how I came to find the courses as a former competitive grappler, because I was going through the standard model and I was full of injuries. I started wrestling when I was a teenager, when I was 14, and then I did judo for a little over 10 years. And then I switched to jiu-jitsu. I've been training jiu-jitsu now a little over 10 years. So really in my peak, like around 2021, when I was doing a lot of judo, I mean, anybody that doesn't know judo, you can Google some clips, but you're effectively getting thrown into the ground at, maximum velocity. And it hurts and things break. And everybody that I would go see, I mean, I saw all the top physios, doctors, chiros, etc. in the UK, where I was competing, in Canada, and in California. And the rehabilitation experience was really frustrating and underwhelming, and effectively nothing was working. So when I was in my early 20s, I just decided, as a hobbyist at that time that just loved to train and compete, that I was going to go and figure out how to bring myself back to the mats after multiple surgeries and injuries. And that's when I found functional range conditioning, and that was really the only system that had worked up until that point. And that's why I use it each and every day with myself and with my clients. So there's really no difference in how I train myself versus how I train a client. It's just scaling it to whether it's a pro football player or whether it's a 80-year-old that just wants to play with her grandkids. And I think that's the advantage of systems thinking and a system versus a method, is that you understand how to scale the kind of training goals and inputs necessary to give you the adaptations that you want.
So how are the traditional systems that we have right now failing us, and where
Mhm.
is FRC picking up the slack and making improvements? Why is this better?
Yeah, I think that, simply put, they're just not joint and connective tissue specific, and
Hmm.
I think that that's still not really digested by a lot of the standard model of training and thinking, and that's, I think, why FRS has worked with over 50 professional teams and organizations and continues to do so, is because it's working, and that's kind of the track record kind of speaks for itself. But a muscle is not a joint, and a joint is not a muscle. There's a difference in how that tissue needs to be trained. And I think that a lot of the standard model has a lot of benefits generally. And I think that'll it does work for a lot of people up to a certain point.
Hmm.
But, secondary training effects are not primary training effects. And I think that's what FRS has done very well for the last 20 years, is explain how to create primary training effects at the joint and connective tissue level.
What do you mean by that?
So if you think about, so let's take like a squat, for example. Okay, somebody likes to squat. A squat is made up of prerequisites. Okay, so what's a prerequisite? Well, a prerequisite is a couple things at the joint and connective tissue level, but to try to keep this in layman's terms, do you have enough ankle dorsiflexion to get into your squat repeatedly, let's say, if that's what you want to do? Do you have enough load-bearing capacity in the connective tissue structures of the knee? Do you have enough capsular workspace at the level of the hip joint? And if the answer is, I'm making this up, yes on my left side, but it's no on my right side, well, what's going to happen when you squat is you're just going to run into that constraint repeatedly, because a
Hmm.
squat doesn't specifically train the workspace of a hip or the load bearing capacity of a knee
Hmm.
or the sufficient, let's say, ankle dorsiflexion. Now, because I'm imagining people going, well, sure it does. But again, primary and secondary training effects. When you do a squat, you're just using whatever you have access to perform the squat. So you can't you can't say that the squat is going to take your hip through all the fundamental range of motion that a hip needs. It's not going to build joint workspace specifically for that hip. It's not going to improve the tissue quality if you have fibrosis in your knee. It's not going to increase the capsular space required at the level of the ankle to create dorsiflexion, which, for people who might not know what that is, just think about your knee being able to go over your toes, right? There's a component of dorsiflexion involved in that when you squat. So what I'm trying to say is a squat has prerequisites. And just because you squat doesn't mean that you have the prerequisites. But you might be able to get away with squatting until you can't. And the
Hmm.
reason why at some point you can't is because there's a prerequisite that you skipped over. And I think if you run this experiment in your head, and I think a lot of, maybe we can speak to the combat sports community a little bit, grapplers, MMA, jiu-jitsu, etc. A lot of grapplers know when they go to do strength and conditioning, and I know that they know this, and hopefully you will also know what I'm talking about, but there are certain things that you can't do in the gym
Hmm.
because something hurts.
Yeah.
That's a problem, right? And so the answer is what we would call, and I'm going to steal from my colleague, my good friend and colleague, Dr. Michael Chivers, is a difference between lateralization, right, or scaling somebody horizontally versus vertically. And what I mean by that, and what he means by that, is if you go to squat and you have a pinch in your hip, and you just go, I'm just going to change the squat. That's fine as a temporary solution, but that's an example of horizontal scaling. you're not working on why your hip is pinching. Does that make sense?
Yes.
And
Do you get a
so
lot of pushback for people who are like, no, 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 but it still helps me. I'm just going to continue to do this, and I'm not going to work any more joint specific stuff.
totally keep doing what you're doing. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's not my hip. I don't want my hip to pinch, and I don't want any of my athletes' hips to pinch. Because the thing is, if you don't think that's a problem, you have to, again, and this is really what our the FRS courses are for, understanding what a pinching hip actually means at the joint level. It's not good. But again, if you want to live the cowboy life, it's not my hip. So have a good time with your pinchy hip. If you don't think that, like, if your priority is that I want to squat on a hip that's pinching, knock yourself out. Like, I'll just keep modifying my squat. But that's not doing anything to address that you have a dysfunctional hip. Does that kind of make sense? Because we all know plenty of, and I know plenty of grapplers and really people that play any sport that can play their sport, but it comes at a cost. And so again,
sure.
but does that kind of make sense? It's not.
Yeah.
It's not like, we're not trying to joint shame people at all. We're just trying to get people to understand, do what you want. Like I tell all of my clients, you just tell me what you want to do, and we'll just tell you the prerequisites that you need, and then we'll train for that, and that's it. And we just continue to do that. So if you want to do jiu-jitsu, great, let's do jiu-jitsu, and let's make sure that you have the prerequisites to do jiu-jitsu. If you want to squat, I am open to whatever goal somebody wants to pursue, but we can't pursue that goal and expect it to go well if we just keep running into constraints, right? And I think that's really where FRS sets itself from the standard model, is we don't work around problems, we work on them specifically. Because if you have a knee problem, a knee is not one thing. A knee is made up of multiple things. You have a sesamoid bone in the middle that has connective tissue around it. You have a meniscus, you have patellar tendon, you have a fat pad, you have coronary ligaments, you have the ACL, the MCL, the PCL, right? So the list goes on. So when you have a knee problem, where exactly is that knee problem? And that's the tissue that we need to address, if that makes sense, as opposed to just saying, and I'll borrow from some rehabilitation that I've been given back when I had knee issues. You just need to strengthen your quads or strengthen your hamstrings. But what is a quad? What does it mean to strengthen a quad when I have a problem in my coronary ligaments in my knee? Because you would agree that like a quad and a hamstring is not a patellar tendon or a coronary ligament or ACL or like what I'm trying to say is they're not the same thing. So to just default, as I had been given advice, to just strengthen your quads more or strengthen your hamstrings. Yeah, we have pictures. I didn't even have to do anything, and we're pulling up pictures. Yeah, so like
Tears is awesome. So I have her here.
Yeah, you can. I mean, you can have a field day looking up pictures of anatomy, and you will quickly see that the knee is not just made up of quads and hamstrings. So, like that's really not debated. So I think what maybe people might try to debate is, oh well, you just train all that stuff anyways when you do like squats and deadlifts and leg extensions and hamstring curls. And then I'll ask them, well, then why do you still have knee problems?
Well, I know I've been told many times, and I remember the day I asked you, I was like, Alex, do you have any recommendations for my knee? Because I think my knee just gave out in practice, and I was feeling some sort of way. And I got this huge lecture.
What did I say?
You were nice, but it was definitely like I got some information. I'll just say that much. I got some information. You have words when it comes to generalized recommendations for specific problems. I know that.
Well, I think, and it's hard because I like to answer those questions because I do want to make people feel like I understand, like, oh, you have a knee problem. Like, I'm so sorry, obviously,
Mhm.
empathizing and trying to point them in the right direction. But the first thing is, I've never met your knee. And I think that we live in a culture where everybody is selling so that now everybody is looking for a quick fix. And that is,
Sorry.
there's always going to be a market for that. And I think, I mean, go for it. There's a million YouTube quick fixes, Instagram quick fixes. The question is that working long term? And if it's not working long term, then maybe the problem is that there's not a quick fix because we kind of forget how tissue works and the species that we are. And like, you can't, I mean, it's biology. Are there any quick fixes for biology, or for biological structures? I don't know.
We
All
want
right.
there to be. I think
We
there's a
want there to
difference.
be, and I'm all
Yeah.
for it. And so do I. I wish it was simpler too, but like, there's a difference between making somebody feel better and working on those tissues that are problematic specifically. And this
actually
is,
helping them get better.
yeah, because if you're in pain and you have knee pain, and I hate to, this is probably gonna, I don't want to say get me in trouble, but just open up a whole can of worms. But like, pain is important and it's good data, but it doesn't tell you what to do specifically about that problem, like what's contributing to that pain. I recommend a great book, and I can't remember the authors, but it's called Explain Pain, and it effectively talks about the biopsychosocial model. And unfortunately, like, what we think, or what we, I think, do a really good job of is address the biological, basically, contributors to nociception or to pain, because there is a component of pain that comes from biological tissue. If you scroll down, I think Butler is one of, yeah, that one. That's the book. Oh my God, it's $148. I promise I am not sponsored by them. I don't get any money.
Kindle, you can get it for $30.
Yeah, there's also, I mean, there's tons of good pain science books, but effectively biological structures and their role in feedback. And when I say feedback, like giving you things like pain, that can be addressed, because if you have better quality tissue, pain should decrease. But if we only focus on, let's say, psychological and social or cultural factors, that's obviously super important and has its place, but that's not going to address the biological constraints, if there are one. Does that kind of make sense? So it's like, if somebody's in pain, I could talk to them in a nice voice. I could give them a massage. We could do all kinds of different things that will make them feel better. And that's certainly valuable. But I did not address the biological tissue that might be involved in that feedback of pain. If that
makes sense. It makes sense. Have you seen any athletes go through a major injury and then use the FRC system and come out as better athletes?
Yeah. We have lots of examples of that. I can speak to that briefly. We can also pull up some of those videos I sent you just to kind of talk about that from a case study standpoint. Okay, so here's a swimming athlete. I'm gonna really try to not use technical language as best I can, because I want to make it really simple so that intuitively this just makes sense. Okay, so on the left, I can't remember if it says, I think it'll say week 1 and week 4. So this is 4 weeks. It is their initial intake, right? So this person is trying, let's just think about this again really simply. They want to take their arm and they want to move it overhead. We can all agree this is like a basic swimming position. Take your arm, move it overhead so you can create the front stroke or whatever stroke you want to do. So as this person goes, let's ignore the video on the right for now. As this person goes to move their arm overhead, he's running into what feels like a restriction. You can see also in his face, like, again, think about this simply. Why should it be so hard for you to move your arm over your head. Like, we don't even have a weight. I just want you to move your arm overhead into the position that you need for your sport. Can't do it. Okay, there's a cost here. Okay, because I know this case, because this is obviously my client. He's pinching and he's pointing to the back of his shoulder. I'm pinching back here. Again, like, basic, move your arm overhead. I can't, it's pinching. Okay, that's a problem. So what are we going to do about that? Okay, let's just go through this again. Look, like, I asked him, you can't hear it in the audio because I muted it. Can you move your arm any further? Does the pinch get worse? Does it stay the same, etc.? Just tell me what you feel. Does this look like a face that you should be making to just move your arm overhead?
Absolutely
no.
Not.
Right? So this is not good. This is a problem, right? So instead of saying, which again, I've had multiple times as advice from providers, well, just don't go into that position. That doesn't help me solve my problem because I need to get into that position. In this case, if he's a swimmer.
Or they tell you stop doing your sport, which I hear a lot as a jiu-jitsu athlete. Oh, just don't train anymore.
Yes, which I also heard a lot. Sorry, can we go back to that shoulder real quick? Oh, I can do it. Okay. So okay. Look. So now on the right, just for completeness sake. So now on the right, do I need to blow this up? There we go. So now on the right, he's going through the same range of motion. But let's just look again, try to keep this really simple. It's not perfect, but I think everybody can agree that that's a lot better than this photo on the left. Yeah.
And so yeah, it looks way better. So you use the it's a magic trick.
Yeah, it's
don't look
totally magic. I just told him fake it in the first one and then show me your shoulder in the other video. Sorry, you were going to ask.
Yeah, so did you say this is a 4-week difference between the first video and the second?
Yeah, so that's 4 weeks of working specifically on the limitations of his shoulder. Again, remember, a shoulder's not one thing. A shoulder has lots of different joint, connective tissue, and muscular structures. So when there's a constraint, there's not an exercise that you're going to do if you have a pinch in your shoulder. You're not going to exercise your way out of that because exercise is general, right? Like exercise it's too general. It's not joint and connective tissue specific, which is why he's a perfect example of somebody who does a lot of exercise. He swims. Swimming is amazing. I'm a huge fan of swimming. He also does some weightlifting in the gym, but he keeps having this shoulder pinch. So it's not a problem. And people might be thinking, well, just give him other exercises for his shoulder. The problem is that his shoulder is pinching. That's indicative that he has a joint specific problem in that shoulder. You're not going to strength train your way out of what we call a closing angle pinch. I said I wouldn't use technical language. So let me just explain very briefly what that is. He's trying to move his arm overhead. Okay, this side is opening. This side is closing. Is that pretty intuitive? Opening.
Yes.
As I go overhead, closing. He's pinching on the closing side. Okay, that's a problem. That's a problem at the level of the joint and the surrounding connective tissue. So again, an exercise, somebody says, we'll do shoulder strengthening exercises. The definition of a dysfunctional joint is that it cannot manage movement or load well. So you can't just add strength to that, if that makes sense. If you have an issue creating fundamental motion in the shoulder, there's not an exercise that is going to increase the range of motion specifically where you need it in that shoulder. What about stretching? Well, stretching is, again, not joint and connective tissue specific. Stretching is really important, and we certainly go into how you can do that more joint and connective tissue specific in the FRS courses. But think about it. If I just told him to stretch in this overhead position, he's pinching already. So hopefully that just helps tie together why you can't use general solutions for specific problems. And I think that's, obviously I'm beating a dead horse at this point, but I like to try to get clients and people in general to just understand, in a lot of ways, you kind of know that something's not working. That's why people come to see me, right? I've tried everything, nothing's working. That's why I found this system. I tried everything, nothing was working. As a grappler, there's pretty high demands. This combat sports, there's a high demand in that sport. And there's two ways to go about it. You can respect that the sport is going to place a high demand on your body, and you can do something and train so that you can mitigate injuries and really the insults of that sport. Or you can say, I'm just going to ride it till the wheels fall off. And again, it's not a judgment. If that's what you want to do, that's totally fine. As long as people know that there is a cost to that, and you don't have to live or train that way. Especially,
I surely didn't
if
know
you're a
there was a
hobbyist.
cost to this. Yeah, exactly. I saw somebody asked a question, because they were talking about all the injuries that happen in jujitsu and if it was even worth it to try it. It's like, well, I'm doing this to empower myself to learn self-defense or just to do some fun activity. But at the end of the day, they're training and now they have all these injuries. So they're like, is it even worth it for me to go into this sport in the first place?
It's a great question. That's a question that I would throw back at the person. I can't
Mhm.
I can't tell you what your goals should be. And to a certain degree, like, I want to do jiu-jitsu, I don't want to do jiu-jitsu. That's a personal decision. But I think it's important to know the risks, and I think it's also important to know the demands. But I really think that the bigger, question or way to frame it is jiu-jitsu worth it to you? And if
Mm.
it's worth it to you, then do it, but just train appropriately. Prepare your knees for the demands of that sport. Like, just like you hear with so many runners, I can't run anymore, I have bad knees. Flip that script. Train your knees so that you can run. If running matters to you, train your knees specifically so that you can run. If jiu-jitsu matters, train your knees so that you can do jiu-jitsu. Because at the end of the day, there is going to be a cost. And this is what I cannot tell you what the cost is. I can't predict the future. I have no idea when you will get injured, the severity or magnitude of that injury. I have no idea. But I can tell you that there's stuff that you can do to create buffers so that your capacity is always larger at the joint and connective tissue level than the demand of that sport. That's really what training should be about. And that's why, even if you want to make the argument that, well, jiu-jitsu or kickboxing or any of these sports, there's a high degree of range of motion that you train. Not primarily, secondarily, right? I mean,
Yeah, that's true.
somebody has a really stiff hip. That hip is not going to get more mobile specifically just by doing jiu-jitsu, right? Oh, but I stretch. Okay, but again, like, the intervention, remember, a hip is not one thing, a stretch is not one thing. So when we get into, like, the nomenclature of these solutions, it's really easy to unpack why they're too general. I'm not saying they're not good and they're not valuable. We just need to dial in the specificity and tailor it to that person. Well, what are you stretching? What are you trying to stretch?
Mhm.
What do you need to stretch? How are you going to actually improve the tissue quality in that hip and the load bearing capacity specifically for jiu-jitsu, for what you need based on, like, how constrained or dysfunctional your hip is? Because I think everybody would agree, and I'll use a combat sports like analogy, nobody grapples the same. Everybody's different, right? When you grapple them, or when you do kickboxing, like, nobody has the exact same uh, movement patterns, let's say. And that's what makes it fun. And in that same way, no two people have the same hip. No two people have the same knee. So if you just do what your training partner is doing for their knee, and you assume that that's going to be good for your knee, you see how there's a step that's being skipped. Like, well, what is the capacity and who assessed your knee, and how do you know that you need this input versus that input versus this stretch versus that exercise? And when you really break it down, a lot of it is just I'm throwing paint on the wall and seeing what sticks.
Pretty much, yeah. That's pretty much.
But that makes sense, right? It's like my shoulder.
I wish there were more FRC and FRS coaches in all sporting environments, but they're not. And I know when we first started training, this information wasn't even as prevalent out there, right? It wasn't as mainstream. It's not now, I would say, but it's not. I definitely didn't know anything about mobility when I first started training, and my coaches didn't really know or care. They're just like, "Do the move, just do it." It's like, "Well, I can't move this way," and then they would just yell at you,
Exactly.
and eventually it might have happened, or you would just get frustrated as you were trying to progress.
Or you compensate. You just do it, but the movement comes from somewhere else.
Exactly.
And that was something that I was going to say with that. We don't need to pull it up necessarily, but that shoulder client that I showed, right? If your body needs to, or I really force or ask you to throw that arm up overhead however you can, you'll do it, but it's just going to come from somewhere else. You're going to compensate. And so that's just happening at a lot faster speeds and volume when you play your sport. So if you have a knee problem, it doesn't mean you can't play your sport, but you're just going to compensate. And that compensation has a cost. And again, this is where I can't tell you what the cost is specifically, unless we obviously do, an assessment or something. But there's no two ways about it. Like, show me a world-class athlete and I will praise their skills and their technical superiority. And, it doesn't take anything away from their accolades. But make no mistake about it, your display of skills and performance in sport is not indicative of your physical capacities at the tissue-specific level, because there's plenty of evidence about world-class athletes that are full of chronic dysfunction and pain.
Yeah.
So that's why it shows you that you can still do that. You can still compete. Mm-hmm. But what's that cost? And again, that's why I think if you look at on the Functional Anatomy Seminars website, you can also look at all the list of pro athletes and teams and organizations and such that we've worked with, because they understand the importance of training these weak points. Because a weak point is just going to sit there until it gets worse. Basically, it's not going to, fix itself. If you have a hole, in the foundation, the hole doesn't patch itself up by itself. Like, that hole's going to sit there and get worse, or if something insults it, it'll explode. It's not going to get solved by doing general stuff, and it's not going to get solved by just resting or taking time off. And as my colleague Hunter Cook says, it's the two things humans hate most is time and effort. And I try to add to that specificity too, and just understanding that I know you want a simple solution, but I'm not the guy that's going to give it to you, because it's just not that simple. And if you keep looking for simple solutions, you're not going to fix or solve or improve the issues that you're having. And it's not to say that it's so complicated, because that's certainly not what I'm also trying to say is like, oh, it's too complicated for most people. No, it's not that complicated. It's just not as simple as we've sold it to be. So that's also one of the big, I think, battles that we come up against, or I'll come up against. I'll just speak for myself, just working with clients and such, is the difference between those that get it and want to do the work and those that are like, yeah, this is too much work. Again, no problem. It's too much work. I get it. It is a lot of work, but it's your physical health. And, that's up to you to decide what the cost of that is.
How do you deal with those clients?
Well, it's totally up to them. I mean, I can't change how to train a joint, because the evidence and the science has told us this is what we need to do. So I know what works. And if that's too much work for you, we can have you do maybe less work, but still create some favorable inputs. But like if you have a dysfunctional joint and you just keep deciding I want to squat and do jiu-jitsu, you tell me how that goes. And again, I'm not trying to be facetious. It's just that's a personal decision, right? My job is to tell you this joint needs to be trained. I'm not saying don't do your sports. I'm just saying let's not do stuff that insults it. Let's work on injury management on the side. Let's bring up your weak points specifically and keep you doing what you want to do. That's totally doable. That's 100% doable. So it just depends on what the goals are. So athlete goals are completely up to them. My job is to tell you what you need in terms of like how you're going to meet your goals, and in terms of keeping the cost of those goals down from a physical health standpoint, because that's really what why people work with me and why people seek me out, is because we're going to identify those and we're going to work on them, and we're going to try to keep you doing what you want to do, unless what you're doing is so insulting and so like you're just in so much chronic pain that maybe we actually have to table that for a little bit. But maybe it's worth it, because then you actually get to build up your joint and connective tissue capacity, so that when you go back and play that sport, you're not just going in circles, which is a lot of people. They get injured, they take time off. They come back, they get injured again, take time off. And it's just this spiral of getting injured, taking time off, getting injured, taking time off. So hopefully that answers. That's kind of how I would deal with that. But I don't know. I think I'm allowed to say a little bit about this. So a lot of the pros that we work with, obviously they're also.
I saw you guys are working with the Miami Heat. I saw that.
Yeah. So I was going to say, like, athlete wise, people like to be pretty private, but there are some that have been public about it. That's also because, pro athletes don't want people to know necessarily like their injuries and such. But there are people that have been like athletes openly discussing, their use of the system. And you can see that, especially if you look at, Dr. Andrea Ospina's page, or John Quint, or any of my colleagues that have worked with, everybody from pro NFL linemen to Cirque du Soleil athletes. So some of them are more public about their use of the system than others. But the teams, exactly. I think it was this weekend, Dewey Nielsen and Dr. Michael Chivers were with Miami Heat, teaching and certifying their staff. So, like, I think all of that also speaks for itself in a lot of ways, because if the standard model was working, then,
they wouldn't reach out to you guys.
Yeah. And so I was down with, back in October, with some teams in Arizona. And again, I don't know how private they want me to keep it. So it was with Dr. Spina and John Quint, two of my colleagues, and we were teaching the functional range systems internal strength model. And one of the big conversations that we had, and this was actually outside of the lecture, this was with talking to some of their athletic and rehabilitation staff, is, going through all of these performance metrics that they have, and basically how excited they are about all these technologies. And again, I'm not like, they have their place. That's great. It's awesome to measure how fast the ball spins and goes, the moment of impact, being able to see the athlete move in slow motion and force plates. All of these tools are great. But where's the data on the hamstring tear problem that you're having, that they're talking to us about? We have chronic hamstring tears. So we're so.
Would you say that's a major injury that you see in that sport that you're talking about specifically? Was that football?
So that'd be baseball. That was baseball.
Oh, baseball.
Some pro baseball teams, but totally UCL injuries to the elbow, or rotator cuff issues with the shoulder in baseball players. That's what is crazy to me, and I think my team would agree with this, is we're so obsessed with performance nobody's looking at the cost of performance. We just care about, can you drive the car, not that the wheels and the engine's about to fall off. And that to us, because of what we do and how we teach, really from a systems thinking model. I mean, think about what is the value of like prolonging a pro athlete's career. You know, what's the value of having a better performance or a better cost to performance ratio? What's the value of having somebody finish a career and still be able to play with their kids and not have a bunch of joint replacements coming up? You know, what's the cost of 20-year-olds that are, you know, in litigation or suing their pro team because they have to have a hip replacement at 20 years old? Because
well, the owners surely aren't thinking about it. They're just probably thinking about the end result,
yeah,
which is
and I think
a conversation
that's,
for another day, probably.
Totally. And I think what I'm really trying to push is we're so performance oriented that, you know, there's really no discussion around the cost of that and how to do that from a longevity perspective, and also how to do that not only from a longevity perspective, but from a realistic perspective of the difference between a pro athlete and a hobbyist. Because I know a lot of hobbyists that think they're pro athletes. You're not a pro athlete. You don't need to train like one. But that's for you to decide. But if you're going to consult with me and we're going to have a conversation about your goals and, you know, what are the demands being placed on these capacities that you have, which, you know, may be very low at the joint and connective tissue level, you know, what are we doing? What are we doing if, you know, you're not in a professional organization, you know, you're not, like, at least some of these guys are getting paid very well, right? If the cost is that they're going to rack up a bunch of injuries. And I'm not saying that's necessarily worth it or not. Again, that's a personal decision, but you would agree there's a lot of hobbyists that, like, what's the cost of that long term? You know, is that really what you want your goal to be? And is that really the trajectory that you want to do or that you want to undertake? Or do you want to train in a manner that you can continue to do your sport and just maybe take the insult down a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, we both talked about being former competitive athletes, right, in jiu-jitsu, and for a long time, when you and I started, there wasn't really that professional scene that there is now. So now I'm pushing a higher age, and I'm just, you know, trying to calm down. I'm not even thinking about competing anymore. I just want to do this for fun.
Mm-hmm.
So it's definitely difficult to choose which path you want to go, at least in our sport in BJJ, when it's so easy to decide, hey, I'm going to do fight to win, or I'm going to do WNO if you're being asked for it.
Totally.
But the backing isn't there if you're not like a Gordon Ryan or a Craig Jones. And even at that level, I'm not even sure if the backing is there like an NFL athlete or an MMA fighter would have when it comes to their health.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I mean, we, you know, the FRS team has worked also extensively with like the UFC Performance Institute. So it's not that the knowledge, again, it's not that the knowledge isn't accessible. It's not that it's getting to a lot of these athletes. It's just, I hate to use this word, but it's the best word I can use, and I certainly don't mean to like insult any athletes, but it is a fitness IQ. And that's it. It's like, if you have some amount of fitness IQ, you understand that your body is something that you use and that you also have to take care of if you want it to take care of you. And I don't care what your sport is. Like, that's just like kind of health 101, right? Again, I've met plenty of athletes at the world-class level who are just like, I don't care. I don't have time. At some very elite jiu-jitsu schools that I've been to and talked with some of those athletes about their injuries pretty extensively. And you ask them what they're doing and they're not doing anything because they just want to grapple. how well do you think your career is going to go? Again, and it's not to say you might not have some great success in your career because you compensated,
Mm-hmm.
right? So it's again, it's all over the place in terms of like that default mindset of I'm just going to roll. I just want to train. I'm a pro grappler. I have to grapple, um, this many times a week at this intensity, which in a lot of cases I'm going to agree with for the most part. If you're a pro, yeah, you got to grapple a lot. But what are you doing outside of grappling to prepare and train the capacities of your anatomy for the demands of grappling? And the answer is usually not very much or nothing very specific. But, it's also easy to, I don't know if, confirmation bias would be the right word here, but well, I've made it this far, right? Like I'm a world champ. Why would I need to do joint connective tissue specific training? Sure, there's an argument there. Yeah. But then what happens when, that next match happens and something explodes, or right? Like all of these, like just because you can get away with it, it doesn't mean that you're not taking a risk in a lot of ways. And again, that's a risk that's up to the athlete. But there is absolutely time outside of your training to work on your joints and connective tissues. Also, and I'll say this, because so many jiu-jitsu athletes train like they're powerlifters, but that's not
Or
their sport.
bodybuilders, which is what I did too.
Totally. And again, it's like,
Yeah.
I'm totally fine again with whatever your goals are, right? You want to look good, right? You want to be strong. We can get into what that actually means, what strength actually means. And I'd be quoting the FRS internal strength model, which was a course that was developed a couple of years ago now. Strength is a emergent behavior that comes from synergies between joint muscle and connective tissue. How many strong people do you know? I know a lot of strong people, but I also know a lot of those strong people have a lot of dysfunction. So I'm not saying you're not strong in the conventional sense of the word, but I also know a lot of really strong people that don't have chronic pain and dysfunction because they hit those other two ecologies of joint and connective tissue, because that's where things fall apart in a lot of conventional strength training. And you can hear John Quint lecture about this ad nauseum. He's worked extensively with Westside Barbell for the longest time. Westside Barbell for, I think, 20 or 30 years has just continued to produce the strongest people on the planet Earth. So those people know something about strength training. And one of the things that he would say would be that, somebody can have a bench press block, let's say, and they'll get really, really good at bench press, really strong numbers. But then what happens to their shoulder joint? It goes down in function because they weren't training the shoulder joint specifically. They were training bench press. Bench press is not a shoulder joint. Yeah, Westside Barbell. Obviously, Louis Simmons, anybody who's familiar with him. John Quint, who is an FRS instructor and works out of Westside. Yeah, a lot of strong man equipment obviously popping up. But the point is that your sport as a grappler is not the same as powerlifting. Doesn't mean I'm not a huge fan of powerlifting. Doesn't mean I'm not a huge fan of people doing powerlifting as part of their training. But again, if that's all of your training is powerlifting, but your primary, or let's say, sorry, you're outside of jiu-jitsu, you're doing powerlifting, that's not helping your hip joint specifically to have a more dynamic guard, because you can create more internal and external rotation and flexion of the hip, and you have good reactive strength in that hip when somebody tries to smash past you, or you can sustain 10 rounds with that hip joint and have endurance in the tissues of that hip. That's
Well, I know yeah. Go, sorry. I didn't mean to cut you off.
Sorry. No, that's fine.
I know I've worked with a lot of former bodybuilders and powerlifters who can't even get up and down very well. You look good, you've got a lot of muscle on those bones. You can pick up, 300, 500 pounds or whatever, but you can't get off the ground to save your life, literally.
Yeah, and I think so. And just so it's not to knock on powerlifters at all, because I have a
Mm-hmm.
huge respect for the sport and for powerlifters in general.
Yeah, for sure.
But let's be clear: if your sport is powerlifting, then guess what? Your sport is to be as strong as possible. However, if your goal in your sport is not powerlifting, then to have a goal of I'm just going to be as strong as possible is actually not a good goal. How about as strong as necessary? Right? Like
Mm-hmm.
that's the difference between understanding how you could use powerlifting to help your goals, let's say in jiu-jitsu, but you're not just going to only do powerlifting in jiu-jitsu and expect that somehow your hip joint capsule is going to have sufficient internal and external rotation, let's say, or as I mentioned earlier, with being able to have a dynamic guard or whatever these jiu-jitsu demands on the hip are, like that would make a good guard player. You're not going to develop that with powerlifting and with jiu-jitsu. And so what I'm trying to say is an athlete that plays a dynamic sport like jiu-jitsu or soccer or baseball or whatever the sport is, that sport has a lot of dynamic demands on a hip that are not trained in just squatting and deadlifting. Again, I'm not saying I'm not a huge fan of squatting and deadlifting, because I am, but that's not training the hip to do hip joint specific things dynamically in your sport, right? And I think that's where people need to understand the difference between training and practice, practicing your skills versus training your physical capacities, and understanding that when you want to train your physical capacities, the whole goal should be that you're bringing in better quality anatomy to your skill development. Because when you do jiu-jitsu, this whole idea, I should knock this myth out too while I'm at it, like I'm going to get my strength and my cardio and my endurance, or whatever people say, just by doing jiu-jitsu. No, you're not. Right? Because jiu-jitsu is like,
They're trying to
it's
be
like,
Marcelo Garcia.
yeah, it's the same thing saying like, well, I'm going to do bicep curls, and my bicep curls is going to train the capsular tissue of my elbow. It's going to improve my ability to pronate and supinate. It's going to address the fibrosis on my anconeus or my supinator. But a bicep curl is not going to do all that. It can't. Like, you see how we want more out of exercises in our sport than they're actually able to give us, because like there are like that's the law of specificity. You do jiu-jitsu, you're going to get better at jiu-jitsu, but it's not guaranteeing you're going to get a better hip joint. You squat, same thing. You're going to get better at squatting.
Yeah.
Right?
I have a
Not
few
hip
more
joint.
questions for you.
Sorry,
Alex.
yeah, please. I'm
I
just
know
going.
he's just ripping. Practice. We're talking about practice. Practice.
That would have been a good time to cue that up, huh?
Yeah. I don't think Tirza knows that clip though.
No, it's okay. Yeah. It has nothing to do with what we're talking about.
She's a major shit talker, but she's wanting to be quiet today because I guess she's tired. Lame. Anyway. What was I gonna say? I don't remember. Oh, great. I do have a question about you had some statistics on or just some background information on common injuries you get from sports. Do you have any for gender specific, like do you notice any injuries that happen more towards women, female athletes than male athletes?
Yeah, so I'd have to reference like that specific literature, and I know there is literature that will discuss differences between likelihood of injuries. I believe, and I'm pulling this off the top of my head, so don't quote me, like ACL specific between like men and women being more susceptible to ACL injuries. I believe that would be this, let's say, one of the studies or the study. But, and again, there's some, obviously, like there may be some legitimacy to that, but it doesn't change the fact that a male and a female both have connective tissue in their knee joint. It needs to be trained. So again, it's Sure. Are there differences in likelihood of injury that you can find in literature? Totally. But that doesn't change. You see how like it doesn't change that, well, if a woman came to see me for her knee or a man came to see me for her knee, we still have to train that knee joint specifically. Now, if neither of them do nothing for their knee, for their sport, like, yeah, could you say like, well, maybe the woman is more likely because of X study? Sure. But you see how like I would rather just say, like, let's train your knee,
You
regardless
don't
of.
care too much of why the injury happened or how it happened, just looking at the
Well, I
injury
care
as such.
how and why. I just care that we're doing something to create a buffer, and we're doing something to
Mhm.
mitigate the risk of that injury or the magnitude and severity of that injury. Because if you think about it, like you're building, people talk a lot about building armor in the fitness community. I mean, what better armor to have than joint and connective tissue specific armor? Like that's the deepest stuff. That's where I want my armor. And what does it mean to actually have armor, quote unquote, from a scientific standpoint? And that would require people to understand what it actually means from a tissue specific capacity to have good connective tissue quality in the architecture of the connective tissue, the load bearing capacity, etc. That to me would be armor. So I would want to do that whether it was a male or a female, regardless of that data, because that data doesn't really tell me what I should and shouldn't do. It just tells me, oh, maybe women are more susceptible to X injury than men. Okay, I sure. Again, it could still be true, but I'm still going to train that female client like she needs more stiffness in that joint or that tissue. And that's actually a really good question in a lot of ways, because we could just tie this into people that are hypermobile, for example.
Mhm.
Hypermobility is in a lot of ways you can train so that connective tissue and that joint have less laxity, because laxity
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 for the
so
people who
layman's
understand what
terms,
it's.
loosey goosey joint,
Okay.
right? Lots of range passively, right? Very
Yeah.
bendy people. That doesn't mean that just because you're bendy doesn't mean you're going to absorb and manage forces well. And so if your sport needs you to do that, you need to react, you need to stiffen that tissue so that it doesn't explode. That's something that you can train. So because we have a ton of, I think literally all of my colleagues, including me, have worked with hypermobile dancers, yogis, circus artists. And again, their sport, they need a lot of range. Absolutely. But you also want to be able to stress stiffen in that range, meaning that your connective tissues can absorb and manage load. Because if they can't, and if you think of a lot of athletic movements, the inability to do that well is going to lead to a greater likelihood of
Injury.
injury.
Mhm.
So that's why range of motion.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, that's why range of motion. I don't know where you
We're
find this
getting off
stuff.
topic.
Yeah, I mean, look at this guy.
This is
This
too
is
much. I'm sorry.
yeah.
I'm probably gonna have nightmares now. That's great.
But you understand, like, that is a different capacity. So let's take that guy. Let's put him in football. How well you think that's going to go?
Not great. Yeah.
Not good, right? Because again, that's why your sport matters. That's why it's important to identify what you need for your sport. Because, and I'll maybe go into this a little bit and then we can go through more of your questions. Mobility is definable 100% scientifically. Most people say that word and they think that mobility is rolling on a foam roller or doing activation exercises, whatever that means. I don't know what that means. Or, um, you know, uh, certain movement patterns. I'm doing, this flow. This is my mobility flow. Um, Mobility is not any of those things. Mobility is flexibility plus strength. And we'll just use a layman's understanding of strength. So you don't just want to be flexible, you want to have control in the ranges of motion that you can
Mhm.
access. Wait,
Tears just wrote Vaughn doesn't believe in yoga, which is not true. We've had this discussion before. Anyway.
you want to talk about that?
No, I don't.
I think
I
yoga's
don't want to
great.
talk
I
about it.
think yoga is an
Yeah.
amazing practice. I think it does a lot of awesome things for people from a, meditation standpoint, community building, generally building flexibility. You notice I use generally versus specifically in certain poses. It's been around forever. There's a lot of legitimacy to yoga, but please understand, and I'm sure it's, the yogis will come after me for this, but yoga is not joint and connective tissue specific. And that's why I have tons of clients that have gotten injured doing yoga. I'm not saying yoga is bad. I'm just saying that you have to understand what, what your goals are when you're doing yoga. Because if it's just to be more bendy and get into this position and something is pinching or hurting, and the answer is that the instructor comes and pushes and rams you into that position further, that's not good. Or you push yourself into that position, that's not good. But embrace the pain or suck it up, or I don't know. I'm not a huge fan of that, because just think about it logically. Like, there's feedback coming to you from your anatomy that says, hey, this hurts. Let's get that assessed. Let's not smash and ram our way into that further. So I think yoga is great for building, general flexibility, but by no means are you building joint connective tissue specific control and strength in those positions.
Yeah.
Again, just back to the law of specificity.
Yeah. Again, that's what I was saying too when we were having this discussion.
Oh, perfect.
About it being, it's not strength training. And I think that's kind of where she just calls me out. Fawn doesn't like yoga. And I'm like, that's not what I'm saying. It's not strength training. It was never meant to be strength training. But anyways, Tirza, you should be on this just to
Did
talk
you
shit
have,
if you want
I
to.
feel like I've been cutting off your questions. Did you have more
No.
questions? No?
I do, not really, but I do. And the last question is, really, what do you have coming up? And actually, you recently did like a summer program, I think, at Steadfast FRC summer program. How did that go?
Yeah. So we're going to be, I'm going to be doing some, we're almost September. So I'm going to be running effectively a fall, let's just call it a fall program. That's going to be Kinstretch. Kinstretch is effectively group mobility training as we define it in the FRS system, which is flexibility plus strength. So better control over the range of motion that you have, building range of motion, how to actually do that systematically. Again, it's a group class. It is very difficult. It is, and this is not a knock on yoga, because yoga is also very difficult, but it's yoga on steroids. Anyways, I'm going to be doing that in the fall. I'm also going to be doing some small group training that'll incorporate the FRS internal strength model, which you can see above that. This is our GPP. So this is how we, there might be a video that people can watch, but there's tons of examples and demonstrations and such of what Kinstretch is. You can just mute it. And so I'll be running this in October, doing some small group training. We have some seminars coming up in September. You can look at the Functional Anatomy Seminars website. As you said, Vaughn, you're going to the Atherton seminar. I think there's Denver, there's Dallas, there's France. There's a bunch of those coming up. So if you're interested in being a provider and actually taking a course and getting certified and not just learning or thinking that you're learning. And yes, I am taking a stab at people that think that they learn anything from social media. That's not a course. That's 10 seconds of your attention span, but that's the age that we live in. So if you actually want to take a course with us, you can look at our website here and check out the seminars to find one near you. If you can't, there's also online seminars, which are fantastic. That is about everything that I really have that's coming up. Kin stretch classes will be at Steadfast. Small group training classes will likely be out of Pacific Strength in Oakland. So those will be a combination of joint and connective tissue specific training, and then doing some S&C in conjunction so that you can work on your strength and endurance and other fitness goals. So that'll be coming up in October. I'll be doing some marketing for that in September. My website is theartofstrong.com. People can look that up. If you want to learn more, as I mentioned, about functional range systems, there's lots of YouTubes. Make sure it's from our channel, because the internet ruins all nice things. And I don't know what's on the internet sometimes. Yeah, you can go to About, you can read about me. You can do this. You can start with some basic joint maintenance. You can also read a little bit more about sports and how we might approach your sport. So if you're in martial arts, jiu-jitsu, wrestling, judo, MMA, there's a little bit of me just speaking to some of these things that I've been talking about with regard to joint connective tissue specific training. Outside of that, I definitely, I have lots of books to recommend if people like to read, which nobody does these days. People just want to go to social media. So you can also not read, but if there's books, if it's helpful, I can mention some books that are great for understanding a little bit more about systems thinking and really like how this approach ties in with physical health and performance. Daniel Lieberman is a fantastic author out of Harvard. He's an evolutionary biologist. He has a book called The Story of the Human Body, and he has another book called Exercised, which are both excellent. Exercise is about the history of exercise. The Story of the Human Body goes a little bit more into sort of the evolution of modern human, Homo sapien, and a lot into like what he calls mismatched diseases, which are diseases that we kind of have because of how we have forgotten the species that we are and the fundamental things we need from a health and wellness standpoint. Stuart Kaufman is great if you like physics. A World Beyond Physics talks a lot about, yeah, I know. So Yvonne just made the face that basically says nobody's going to read that book.
No, I love physics. I'm a math geek.
Oh, good. Stuart Kaufman, yeah, World Beyond Physics. That's a great book about what I believe he calls constraint closure or constraint, effectively. I'm not saying this well. How constraints help with both feedback loops and how constraints help with work, which is how effectively physics has understood like what work actually means. You have to have a constraint of energy for work to be funneled and then for work to emerge from that constraint. I won't get into that too much. Thinking in Systems, Donella Rawlings, I believe, or Donella Meadows, I believe. Great introduction to systems thinking. Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. That's a great book. That's an old one, but a great book about mostly how humans think in System 1 and System 2, and why that's important to be a human that knows how to critically think in an age where our attention spans are just dwindling, and it's unfortunate. Anti-Fragile by Nassim Taleb. That's a great book as well. Scale by Geoffrey West. That's all I had written down here for people that might have had book-related questions. But yes, if you're like, where's the book about FRS? We have courses. We have courses that have like over 20 plus hours of lecture in them that you get access to. So there is not a book if you're looking for an FRS or an FRC specific book, but there is lots and lots and lots of research that you will hear and find out about in courses and such. I think that's it for resources.
That's a lot of books. What's your favorite?
From that list?
Just in general. Just overall.
In general, what's a book that I like? What's a favorite book? God. hang on. I really liked Civilized to Death, which I believe came out just before 2020 by Christopher Ryan. That was really good. I really liked How Emotions Are Made by Lisa Feldman, which is
Okay,
more
one book
psychology.
and why?
I can't do one. Civilized to
Well,
Death
why
was
at
really,
least?
actually, I'm gonna change my mind. I really liked hang on, I just gotta remember the name. 4,000 Weeks by Oliver Berkman. I thought that was a great book. That's a book that's an anti-productivity book. So if you're one of these people that's like, how can I be more efficient? And how can I be more productive? And how can I hack my life? He would argue, which I would agree with, that maybe that's not the way you should live your life. And I'll leave it at that.
And that's the reason why you like it?
Yeah, well, I studied psychology and philosophy in university, so I like existential things.
Okay. Well,
Yeah.
I guess we'll leave the podcast off at being existential, I guess.
Thank you so much for
Yeah.
having me on, and I hope
Thanks
that
for
people find this helpful and useful. I know it's kind of a lot of information, and I'm always trying to make it a little bit more relatable for the layman, or in layman's terms, I should say, for people to grasp. And when in doubt, just do more cold plunge and sauna.
Well, thanks, Alex. Thanks for being on. And before we cut it, just one more time for the people at home. How can they find you and connect with you?
Yeah, so I'm not huge on social media, but I do have an Instagram for work. It's at Alex Nichols. That would be my only social media that I have. My website, as I mentioned, theartofstrong.com. You can also find that through Instagram. Yeah, that's me. Functionalanatomyseminars.com. And the Control Yourself podcast would have a lot of good information that is also done by Dr. Spina. So that is getting information from the source and not secondhand from who knows who on the internet. That's basically it. If you're at Steadfast, I teach the noon class on Wednesdays. We can train, hang out. Other than that, yeah, keep an eye for Kinstretch classes and small group training coming in the fall. And look forward to seeing you, Vaughn, at the gym and then also at the upcoming seminar.
Thank you for watching. You can watch more videos like this one by clicking these links.